Imagine a world that has everything, not the clumsy adolescence of early civilization, the first scratched pictographs, the river mud bricks drying in the Mesopotamian sun, but a world that has had thousands of years to grow into itself. A world with international postal systems, with diplomats exchanging letters across hundreds of miles, with merchant ships carrying wine and tin and lapis lazuli from one gleaming harbour city to another. Imagine a world that is, by any reasonable measure, thriving. That world existed. It was real. And roughly 3,200 years ago, it ended, catastrophically, almost completely, and in ways that historians and archaeologists are still struggling to fully understand. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic and mysterious events in all of human history. It is the story of great empires that shrank overnight into rubble and silence. It is the story of cities that burned and were never rebuilt. It is the story of a writing system so complex that when it finally disappeared, it would not be read again for 3,000 years. And at the centre of it all, mysterious, violent, appearing from seemingly nowhere and vanishing just as suddenly, are the people ancient Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Where did they come from? Were they the cause of the collapse, or were they simply swept up in forces far larger than any single group of people could command? These questions have fascinated scholars for centuries, and the answers, when we can piece them together at all, are stranger and more compelling than almost any legend. To understand the Sea Peoples, though, we first have to understand what they were entering. We have to stand in the world they disrupted, feel its weight and its confidence and its extraordinary complexity, because only then can we appreciate just how astonishing its disappearance really was. The period historians call the Late Bronze Age, running roughly from around 1550 to 1200 BCE, was something genuinely remarkable. It was, in a sense, the first globalized world. Not in the modern, interconnected, digitally linked sense we know today, but in the sense that matters most, which is that the major civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were deeply, intricately, almost inextricably bound together in a web of trade, diplomacy, shared culture, and mutual dependency. At the western edge of this world sat Egypt. Egypt in the full, almost incomprehensible glory of its New Kingdom period. The pharaohs of this era were not the cautious administrators of the Old Kingdom, builders of pyramids in quiet dynasties. These were warrior kings, Thutmose III, who marched his armies across 17 campaigns and carved an empire from the Sudan to the Euphrates. Amenhotep III, who presided over a court of such extravagant wealth that his correspondence partners literally begged him for gold, saying, as one letter preserved in clay tablets records, that gold was as plentiful in Egypt as dust, and Rameses II, the great self-promoter who would fight the Hittites to a standstill at Kadesh, claim victory in every temple inscription across Egypt, and whose mummy we can still visit in a museum in Cairo, the very face of the Bronze Age, preserved in linen and natron across 3 millennia. Egypt's power rested on its fields. The Nile inundation, reliable and generous in this period, deposited rich silt across the delta and the valley every summer, and from those fields came grain in quantities that astonished every visitor. Grain was Egypt's currency in the international world, not coins, which did not yet exist in this period, but measured quantities of wheat and barley, weighed out and recorded by scribes working in the dense trained script of the Egyptian bureaucracy. But Egypt was not alone. To the north and east, straddling what is now Turkey and spreading across Syria and into the Levant, sat the Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and in some ways its mirror. The Hittites were Indo-European speakers who had conquered central Anatolia in the early 2nd millennium and built a state of formidable administrative sophistication. Their capital, Hattusa, sat in a bowl of mountains in central Turkey, a city of temples and storehouses and gates flanked by stone lions and sphinxes. The Hittites were not, as their name might suggest, a simple or barbaric people. They had a legal code that in certain respects was more humane than the more famous Code of Hammurabi. They kept diplomatic archives in multiple languages. They were, in the full sense of the word, civilized, and they were the only power in the Bronze Age world that Egypt genuinely feared. Between Egypt and Hatti, as the Hittite state was called, lay the city-states of the Levantine coast. These were, in many ways, the most important nodes in the entire Bronze Age trading network. Cities like Ugarit, sitting on the Syrian coast where modern Ras Shamra now stands, were extraordinary places, densely populated, polyglot, home to merchants from a dozen different nations and scripts in a half-dozen different languages. Ugarit had warehouses full of copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan or possibly Anatolia, fine painted pottery from the Aegean, carved ivory from elephant hunting expeditions in Syria, cedar timber from the mountains behind the coast. It was a city that lived and breathed international trade, and its wealth was evident in every aspect of its archaeology. The palaces, the temples, the private houses of merchants with their own libraries of clay tablets. And speaking of the Aegean, yes, we should not forget the third great power of this world, the one that until very recently was thought to be purely mythological, Mycenaean Greece. These were the people Homer would eventually write about, the warriors of bronze and the heroes of the siege of Troy. But in the Bronze Age itself, they were something more interesting and less romantic than the Iliad suggests. They were palace builders, administrators, traders, and, yes, occasional raiders. A complex hierarchical society centred on great fortified citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes. Their kings corresponded with the pharaohs of Egypt. Their pottery was found across the entire Mediterranean, from Italy to the Levant to Anatolia. And they wrote. They were among the few cultures of the Bronze Age to develop a writing system for the Greek language, the script we call Linear B, which recorded everything from the contents of palace storerooms to lists of rowers for the fleet. And then there was Cyprus, rich, strategically placed Cyprus, whose copper mines supplied the raw material for the entire Bronze Age. The word copper itself may derive from Cyprus, Kypros in Greek. The great ingots of copper that moved through Bronze Age trade routes, shaped like dried ox hides with 4 handles for carrying, came largely from Cypriot mines, and Cyprus was a place of unusual cosmopolitan complexity, where Egyptian, Aegean, Hittite, and Levantine cultures mixed in ways archaeologists are still working to disentangle. Behind all of this, further east sat the older civilizations, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Kassite kingdoms in Mesopotamia, all connected to the western Mediterranean world by land routes that carried tin, the critical alloying metal for bronze, from sources in Afghanistan and possibly Central Asia, all the way to the foundries of Egypt and Greece. What made this world cohere was not just the movement of goods, though that was remarkable enough. It was the movement of people, ideas, and information. The Bronze Age had a lingua franca, a language of international diplomacy that was not Egyptian, not Hittite, not Mycenaean Greek, but Akkadian, the Semitic language of Mesopotamia, written in the cuneiform script on small clay tablets. A king writing from Egypt to a king in Mitanni wrote in Akkadian. A merchant in Ugarit writing to his counterpart in Cyprus wrote in Akkadian, or sometimes in the local scripts. Ugaritic, a cuneiform alphabet of remarkable efficiency, or Cypro-Minoan, a still largely undeciphered syllabic script. The point is that people communicated. They were literate. They maintained records. The Bronze Age world ran on paperwork. Clay tablet paperwork, but paperwork nonetheless. We know this world so intimately because of a remarkable discovery made in 1887 in a village called El Amana in Middle Egypt. A peasant woman digging for fertilizer. The decomposed mud brick of ancient buildings was called sebach and was highly valued as fertilizer. Dug up a cache of clay tablets that turned out to be the actual diplomatic correspondence of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten with their contemporaries across the Near East. These letters, known as the Amarna Archive, give us an almost novelistic access to the politics of the 14th century BCE. We can read a Babylonian king complaining that the Egyptians have sent him only 2 statues of gold when he explicitly asked for solid gold, not gold-plated wood. We can read a minor Syrian king protesting his loyalty and begging for reinforcements. We can read the diplomatic niceties, the coded insults, the flattery, the genuine warmth between rulers who had never met but who corresponded as brothers. This was a world that understood itself as interconnected. The great kings called each other brother. They exchanged daughters in diplomatic marriages. They sent each other physicians and craftsmen and luxury goods. They maintained a system of international relations with written treaties. The famous peace treaty between Rameses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III, concluded after the Battle of Kadesh, is the oldest known written peace treaty in history, and copies of it survive in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform, with the same text from both perspectives. It was, in short, a world that had learned to sustain itself across enormous distances. A world with redundancies, multiple trading partners, multiple sources of raw materials, multiple diplomatic relationships. A world that seemed, at its height in the mid-14th century BCE, almost impossibly robust. And then something went wrong. Not gradually, not over centuries, but in the space of a few decades on either side of 1200 BCE, this entire system, the palaces, the trade networks, the literacy, the international diplomacy, the cities themselves, collapsed so completely that it would take the Eastern Mediterranean world 500 years to approach anything like the complexity it had before. That is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so haunting. Not just that it happened, civilizations have fallen before and since, but that it was so total, so final, so absolute. There is something particular about reading the last letters of a civilization that does not yet know it is dying. The archive at Ugarit preserves exactly this experience. Ugarit, that wealthy Levantine port city, was one of the last great Bronze Age centres to fall, and in the process of its destruction, it left behind a record of those final years that is almost unbearably vivid. The clay tablets that archaeologists have excavated from the ruins of Ugarit include diplomatic correspondence, legal documents, literary texts, and commercial records spanning several centuries. But it is the very last tablets, found in some cases still in the kilns where they were being fired when the city was destroyed, never delivered, never read by their intended recipients, that tell the most haunting story. One of these last letters was written by the king of Ugarit, a man named Amurapi, to the king of Alashia, the ancient name for Cyprus. The letter is in a state of some alarm. Amurapi writes that enemy ships have been sighted off the coast, that his own army has been sent to Hatti, that his fleet is stationed somewhere in Lucca, a region on the Anatolian coast, and that he has nothing left with which to defend his city. The tone of the letter is controlled but desperate. A king who has spent his life managing the intricacies of Bronze Age diplomacy suddenly finds himself writing not about trade agreements or political marriages, but about survival. The reply he received, also found in the Ugarit archive, is equally chilling. The king of Alashia writes back that he himself has been attacked, that enemy forces have already burned towns in his territory. He offers sympathy but cannot offer help. He advises Amurapi to look to his own defences. The letter ends, and then Ugarit was burned, and neither king apparently wrote again. What makes these letters so extraordinary is what they tell us about the nature of the threat. The enemy that Amurapi describes is not a foreign army in the conventional sense, not a rival. Empire seeking to annex territory, not a known political adversary. He describes something that reads more like a sudden, overwhelming assault. Ships of the enemy have come and burned my towns. The enemy has not come to conquer and administer, it has come to burn and destroy. This pattern, burning without annexation, destruction without a clearly identifiable political beneficiary, is one of the most distinctive features of the Bronze Age collapse, and it is one of the reasons historians have struggled so hard to explain it. In normal historical conquest, somebody wins. A new empire rises from the ashes of the old one. Languages change, cultures transform, but the infrastructure of civilization persists. What happens after 1200 BCE is different. The cities burn, the palaces are not rebuilt, the writing systems disappear, and the populations, the actual people who lived in these places, appear to scatter, to fragment, to disperse into smaller, simpler, more mobile groups. But before we get to the collapse itself, we should stay a little longer with the evidence of the years leading up to it, because those years reveal something important. The Bronze Age world was already under stress before the final catastrophe. The collapse did not come entirely from outside. It was, at least in part, the consequence of a system that had become dangerously brittle. One of the key stresses was climate. This has been one of the most important contributions of recent decades of research. The application of paleoclimatological methods, the study of ancient pollen records, tree rings, lake sediment cores, and isotope analysis of cave formations, to the question of what the climate was doing in the Eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. The results have been striking. The evidence suggests a prolonged period of drought and significantly reduced rainfall across the Eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for a century or more. This is not a minor fluctuation. The studies published by researchers including Brandon Drake and Brandon Garfinkel, and others working with lake sediment cores from sites like Lake Van in Turkey and the Sea of Galilee, suggest a shift to markedly drier conditions across a broad region, exactly the region where the Bronze Age civilizations were most densely concentrated. A drought of this severity and duration would have been catastrophic for agricultural societies that had grown their populations to the edge of what their land could reliably support. Egypt, with its dependence on Nile flooding rather than rainfall, might have been partly buffered, but even Egypt shows signs of stress in this period. The Papyrus Anastasi documents, administrative records from the reigns of the late Ramessid pharaohs, are full of references to famine, to grain shortages, to people fleeing their villages. The grain economy that had supported Egyptian civilization for centuries began to show cracks, but drought alone cannot explain what happened. Because what happened was not just agricultural failure, it was the destruction of cities, the disruption of trade routes, the burning of palaces, the near-total collapse of the complex, interdependent system of Bronze Age civilization. And for that we need people acting in response to the pressures building around them. Other tablets from Ugarit and from Hittite archives speak of famine in ways that clarify just how severe the food situation had become in the years before the final collapse. One Hittite letter, written to the king of Ugarit by the Hittite king himself, is essentially a plea for emergency food aid. The Hittite king writes that there is famine in his land, that the situation is a matter of life and death, and that he needs grain, specifically a very large quantity of grain, to be shipped to the Hittite port of Ura on the South Anatolian coast. The logistics and urgency of this request tell us something. By the reign of the last Hittite king, the heartland of the Hittite Empire was not producing enough food to feed its population. Consider what this means in the context of the Bronze Age system. The Hittite Empire, one of the two superpowers of the age, was dependent on grain imports from Ugarit, itself dependent on the trade networks it sat at the centre of, to prevent famine. If you remove or disrupt any part of that chain, the whole system becomes precarious, and the system was, by the early 12th century BCE, already wobbling. There were internal pressures too. In the Aegean world, the Mycenaean palace economies were increasingly strained. Linear B tablets from Pylos, the palace of the legendary King Nestor on the southwestern tip of Greece, record in their last years a feverish mobilization of resources. Rowers being assigned to their ships, offerings being made to the gods, bronze being collected from sanctuaries, metal dedicated to the gods being stripped and melted down for weapons, the ancient equivalent of a state melting down its heritage in a war emergency. And Pylos had no walls. Uniquely among the major Mycenaean centres, Pylos was unfortified, which suggests either extraordinary confidence or an economy too strained to afford construction. And in its last years, the tablets record something that reads very much like desperate preparation for an attack that everyone knew was coming. The tablet record ends there. The palace of Pylos burned around 1180 BCE, a conflagration so intense that the clay tablets were accidentally fired and thus preserved for archaeologists to find 3,000 years later. Without the fire that destroyed it, we would know nothing of Pylos. The flame that ended the palace also saved its library. And through all of this, the famines, the diplomatic distress calls, the internal mobilizations, the sea peoples appear, gradually at first on the edges of the Egyptian record, and then in one of the most dramatic confrontations of the ancient world, at the centre of it. On the west bank of the Nile, across the river from modern Luxor, there stands a temple complex called Medinet Habu. It was built by Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, who reigned from approximately 1186 to 1155 BCE, that is to say, precisely during the years of maximum crisis. And on the walls of his mortuary temple, Ramesses III had carved what is essentially a detailed account of the most important military events of his reign, illustrated with scenes of battle and accompanied by hieroglyphic texts of considerable length and remarkable vividness. These inscriptions at Medinet Habu are our single most important source for the Sea Peoples. They describe attacks on Egypt in the 5th, 8th, and 11th years of Ramesses' reign, and they contain the most detailed Egyptian descriptions of the mysterious enemies that came from the sea in the north, Let us stand before that wall for a moment and read what it says. The inscription of Year 8, the great sea battle and land battle, is particularly detailed and has the character almost of a royal propaganda film, composed long after the events, but drawing on genuine records and experiences. Rameses III speaks in the first person, as pharaoh gods always did in such texts. The foreign countries conspired in their islands, and the lands were dislodged and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. This passage has fascinated scholars for generations, and for good reason. It explicitly states that the enemies coming for Egypt had already destroyed Hatti, the Hittite Empire, along with Kode, Cilicia, Carchemish, a major Hittite, vassal city on the Euphrates, Arzawa, western Anatolia, and Alashia, Cyprus. These were not small places. These were some of the most powerful polities in the Bronze Age world, and the inscription claims they were swept away in a single destructive wave. Whether this is literally accurate, the boastful texts of Egyptian pharaohs require careful handling, as they tended to describe everything in maximally dramatic terms. The core claim lines up with the archaeological record. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was indeed burned around this time. Carchemish fell. Cyprus was attacked repeatedly. The coastal cities of the Levant burned one by one. Something was indeed moving through the Near East with extraordinary destructive force. The inscription continues with a description of the enemies. Rameses identifies them by name: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and the Weshesh. He says they moved with their households and their possessions, their children and their wives, travelling in ox carts and in ships simultaneously, suggesting a migration as much as an invasion. This is a crucial detail. These people were not simply an army. They were a people in motion, whole communities moving with their families and their worldly goods, suggesting displacement from their own homelands rather than a simple military campaign of conquest. The battle itself, as Rameses describes it, took place on two fronts. On land, an Egyptian army met the enemy at the borders of Egypt, somewhere in the Nile Delta or in the Sinai approaches. On water, the Egyptian fleet engaged the Sea People's ships in what was essentially a naval battle in the mouths of the Nile. Rameses claims, as Egyptian pharaohs always claimed, a total and overwhelming victory. The temple walls show the enemy ships capsizing, warriors struggling in the water, prisoners being led away with their arms bound. They show Rameses himself, giant in the conventions of Egyptian art, seizing enemies by the hair. They show piles of severed hands and other trophies. The Egyptian army counted the dead by collecting hands. But how much of this is propaganda, and how much historical truth? The answer seems to be more than you might expect. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Levant and Anatolia confirms that a major wave of destruction did occur around this period, and that Egypt did, in fact, survive it, in a way that the Hittites and the Levantine cities did not. Egypt's new kingdom continued, weakened, reduced, increasingly dependent on foreign mercenaries, including, intriguingly, some of the very people identified as Sea Peoples, but recognizably continuous. The temples were not burned. The pharaohs continued to reign. The Nile Valley was not devastated in the way that Syria and Anatolia were. So Rameses may well have fought and won a genuine defensive battle. The question is, who were the people he fought and where did they come from? This is where the scholarship becomes as complex and contested as the events themselves, and where we begin the real investigation. The Egyptians gave their enemies names, and those names have been the subject of intense scholarly debate for a very long time. Each of the groups mentioned in the Medinet Habu inscriptions, the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh, and others mentioned in earlier inscriptions, including the Luka, the Ekwesh, the Teresh, the Shardana, has been identified, proposed, debated, and re-identified by generations of scholars, and the identification process is neither straightforward nor complete. But let us work through the most interesting cases, because the detective work involved is itself a window into how we reconstruct history from fragmentary evidence. The Peliset are, arguably, the most important of the Sea People groups for later history. almost every scholar who has examined the evidence agrees the Peliset are the Philistines. The linguistic connection, Peliset to Philistine, is not difficult. The geographical connection is even clearer. After the campaigns of Rameses III, the Peliset appear to have been settled, whether by force or by negotiation, in the coastal strip of southern Canaan that runs from Gaza to Joppa. This is exactly the region the Bible calls Philistia. The 5 great cities of Philistine tradition, Gerza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath and Ekron, have all been excavated by archaeologists, and what they find at all of these sites in the layers dating to around 1200 to 1150 BCE is a sudden, dramatic change in the material culture. Before this period, these cities were Canaanite in character, Levantine Bronze Age culture with Egyptian influences. After this period, there is a quite different cultural assemblage. The pottery changes completely. Suddenly there appears a style of decorated pottery that is clearly related to Mycenaean and Aegean traditions, a locally made but Aegean-derived ceramic tradition that archaeologists have named Philistine bichrome ware. The cooking habits change. There is more pig consumption, which was unusual in Canaanite culture. The architecture changes. A distinctive style of hearth, characteristic of Aegean rather than Levantine buildings, appears in the new settlements. Even the cult objects change. Female figurines of a type associated with Aegean religious traditions appear at these sites in this period. This is exactly what you would expect to find if a population with Aegean cultural roots settled in southern Canaan around 1200 BCE, and it fits perfectly with the Egyptian accounts, which describe the Peliset arriving from the north and west, from the direction of the Aegean, by ship. More recent genetic studies have added another dimension to this picture. A 2019 study published in the journal Nature Human Behavior analysed ancient DNA extracted from skeletons found at the Philistine city of Ashkelon, comparing samples from the pre-Philistine Canaanite period, the Philistine founding period around 1200 BCE, and later centuries. The results were striking. The individuals buried in the founding period showed significantly higher levels of ancestry associated with European populations, specifically with Bronze Age populations from southern Europe and the Aegean. This genetic signature faded in subsequent generations, as the Philistines intermarried with local Canaanite populations, but in the founding population it was clearly present. Someone had come from the Aegean world and settled in Ashkelon. This does not tell us exactly where. Was it mainland Greece, Crete, Cyprus, the Aegean Islands? And the genetic evidence is consistent with several possibilities, but it confirms what the material culture had long suggested. The Philistines were not indigenous to Canaan. They arrived from somewhere to the west and north, and they arrived in the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. Now let us turn to some of the other groups. The Shardana are one of the most interesting, and one of the earliest mentioned. They appear in Egyptian records going back to the reign of Amenhotep III in the 14th century, well before the great invasions of Rameses III. They appear both as enemies, attacking Egypt's Nile Delta ports, and as allies, serving as elite mercenaries in the Egyptian army. Rameses II had a personal guard unit of Shardana warriors, depicted in Egyptian art with distinctive horned helmets and round shields, quite unlike standard Egyptian military equipment. They show up fighting on both sides at the Battle of Kadesh, which is historically unusual, and suggests a group that sold its military services to the highest bidder. Their name has suggested to many scholars a connection with Sardinia, the large Mediterranean island off the western coast of Italy. This identification has been debated, but there is actually some supporting evidence beyond the name similarity. Bronze Age. Sardinia had its own distinctive warrior culture, and Sardinian bronze figurines from the Nuragic period, the remarkable tower-building culture that flourished on the island, show warriors with the distinctive horned helmets that Egyptian art gives to the Shardana. After the Bronze Age collapse, the Shardana disappear from Egyptian records, and the Nuragic culture on Sardinia undergoes significant changes around the same period. A connection, however uncertain, is tantalizing. The Shekelish have been connected by some scholars with Sicily. The name similarity with the later Greek name Sikeloi for Sicilians has been noted repeatedly, though it proves nothing on its own. Others have suggested connections with Cilicia, on the southern coast of Anatolia. The Denian and the Ekwesh have generated particularly heated debate. Some scholars see in the Denian a connection with the Danuna, a people mentioned in Hittite texts as inhabiting parts of southern Anatolia, while others have proposed a connection with the Greek Danaans, one of the terms Homer uses for the Greeks at Troy. The Aquesh, meanwhile, have been speculatively identified with the Achaeans, another Homeric term for Greeks, a connection that would place Mycenaean Greeks among the Sea People raiders, a remarkable and somewhat paradoxical idea, given that the Mycenaeans were simultaneously victims of the Bronze Age collapse. But the most important and most debated question about the Sea Peoples is not where individual groups came from. It is what the entire phenomenon represents. Were they a single organised movement? A confederation of desperate refugees? Multiple independent groups responding to the same underlying pressures? Or something else entirely? To understand where the Sea Peoples came from, we need to go back to the Aegean, to the world of Mycenaean Greece and Minoan Crete, and trace the slow unravelling that was already underway there before the great wave of destruction hit the east. The Mycenaean civilization of Bronze Age Greece is one of the most remarkable cultures in all of ancient history, and it is one whose rediscovery is itself a story of extraordinary intellectual adventure. For centuries, the world of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was assumed to be purely mythological, a poet's imagination, not a historian's record. The great cities of bronze-armed warriors, the palaces of legendary kings, the fleets that sailed to Troy, these were treated as poetic fictions, beautiful and compelling, but not real. Then, in 1870, a German merchant and amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, armed with enormous personal wealth, deep knowledge of the Homeric texts, and a certainty that everyone thought was eccentric, to the point of madness, began digging in northwestern Turkey at a site that locals called Hisarlik, and beneath the surface he found not one city but 9, stacked on top of each other in layers of human habitation going back to the 3rd millennium BCE. One of those layers, Troy 7a, dating to around 1180 BCE, showed evidence of violent destruction by fire, with arrowheads and skeletal remains suggesting battle. Schliemann, not being a careful stratigraphic archaeologist by modern standards, identified the wrong layer as Priam's Troy. He was about 1,000 years off, but the essential discovery was genuine. There really had been a great city at that location, and it really had burned. Schliemann went on to Mycenae itself in the Peloponnese of Greece, where he dug the famous shaft graves and found extraordinary treasures of gold, including the gold death masks that he immediately and romantically attributed to Agamemnon. Again, the chronology was off. The shaft graves are actually earlier than the Trojan War period by about 3 centuries. But the core discovery was real. Mycenae had been a city of tremendous wealth, whose ruling class was buried with gold of extraordinary quality and quantity. Later excavators would flesh out the full picture. The great palaces of Tiryns, Mycenae and Pylos, with their thick stone walls, the so-called Cyclopean masonry, because later Greeks assumed only giants could have built such walls, their frescoed throne rooms, their bureaucratic archives in Linear B. A world that had been forgotten so completely that Homer himself, writing perhaps 500 years after its fall, could only describe it as legend. The Mycenaean world reached its height in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, precisely the centuries of maximum Bronze Age globalization. Mycenaean merchants and possibly colonial settlers appear all across the Mediterranean in this period. Mycenaean pottery has been found from Egypt to the Levant to Sicily to southern Italy to Sardinia. Everywhere the Bronze Age trading world reached. Cyprus, strategically positioned between Greece and the Levant, was particularly deeply embedded in the Mycenaean cultural orbit, so much so that some scholars have argued for actual Mycenaean political control of parts of Cyprus in this period. And then, around 1200 BCE, the same moment as the Great Eastern Catastrophe, the Mycenaean palace system collapsed. This is not a gradual fade. The Linear B tablets from various sites simply stop. The palaces, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, or Komnenos, were all abandoned or destroyed within a few decades of each other. Pylos burned completely around 1180 BCE. Mycenae and Tiryns show destruction levels followed by a much reduced, simpler occupation. The complex administrative bureaucracy, the palace economies, the long-distance trade networks that brought raw materials to the Aegean from across the Mediterranean, all of this vanishes so completely that within a generation or two the ability to write in Linear B was lost entirely. Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, a period of dramatically reduced population, simpler material culture, loss of literacy, and withdrawal from the international world. Villages replaced palaces. Local, handmade pottery replaced the fine, wheel-made ware of the palace period. The complex hierarchical society of the Mycenaean period gave way to smaller, simpler communities, organised around local chieftains rather than palace-based kings. What caused this collapse in the Aegean? This is again a question without a clean single answer. Archaeologists have proposed drought, the same drought affecting the eastern Mediterranean, internal social upheaval, disruption of the trade networks that supplied the Aegean with the tin it needed for bronze making, attacks from external enemies, and, crucially, the possibility that as the palace system broke down and Mycenaean populations were displaced, those displaced people became themselves part of the westward migration and the raiding activity that the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. This last point deserves careful attention. One of the most important and most debated theories about the Sea Peoples is that they were not simply the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but also its product, that the movement of peoples described in the Egyptian records was, at least partly, a refugee crisis of Bronze Age proportions, driven by the same environmental and systemic stresses that were destroying civilization across the eastern Mediterranean. If the Mycenaean palace system was collapsing, if populations were being displaced from their homes by drought, famine, internal conflict and the disruption of trade, then those displaced people would have needed to go somewhere. And where they went, travelling by ship as the Mycenaeans always did, was south and east. Into Cyprus, into the Levantine coast, into Egypt. Sometimes as traders, sometimes as settlers, sometimes as raiders, and sometimes, as the Egyptian texts describe, as whole communities of migrants, men and women and children with all their possessions, looking for new land to settle. This reading of the Sea Peoples as a displacement crisis rather than a simple military invasion is one of the most compelling interpretations in modern scholarship, and it has significant implications for how we understand the character of the collapse. It suggests not a single external force overwhelming an otherwise healthy civilization, but a cascade effect. Drought leading to famine, famine leading to social breakdown leading to migration and raiding, which in turn disrupted the trade networks and diplomatic systems that the remaining palaces depended on, which caused further collapse, which drove further displacement and so on in a widening gyre. But before we settle entirely on this interpretation, we need to consider the other side of the Aegean connection, the island of Crete, and the extraordinary civilization that preceded the Mycenaeans there. Crete is an island of mountains and narrow fertile valleys, of strong north winds in summer and fierce storms in winter, lying at the crossroads between the Aegean, the eastern Mediterranean, and North Africa. It is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and it was the birthplace of the first great European civilization, the Minoans, a people who built a complex, literate, artistically brilliant culture in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE that was entirely unknown to modern scholarship until an eccentric British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began digging at Knossos in 1900. What Evans found, and continued finding over the subsequent 3 decades, was one of the great archaeological revelations of modern times. Beneath the soil of a low hill near the northern coast of Crete, he uncovered a vast palace complex of extraordinary sophistication, multi-storey buildings with staircases and light wells, sophisticated plumbing with terracotta pipes and flush toilets, storerooms of enormous capacity holding hundreds of large ceramic storage jars, throne rooms and ritual spaces decorated with frescoes of breathtaking quality. The frescoes showed scenes of young men and women engaged in the famous bull-leaping ceremonies, athletes vaulting over the backs of charging bulls, along with dolphins and flowers and priestesses in elaborate dress that could almost be described as fashionable by any era's standards. Evans named his discovery the Minoan civilization, after the legendary King Minos of Crete, the ruler of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, and although the name is Evans's invention, we have no idea what the Minoans called themselves. It has stuck. The Minoans had their own writing systems, 2 of them, in fact, called Linear A and the older Cretan hieroglyphic, neither of which has been fully deciphered to this day. We cannot read Minoan in the way we can read Linear B Greek. which means that we know the Minoans largely through their material culture. Their art, their architecture, their religious symbolism, their trade goods scattered across the Mediterranean. What we can say is that the Minoans were a maritime trading power of the first order. Minoan artifacts appear across a vast geographical range, in Egypt, in the Levant, in Cyprus, in the Aegean Islands. Minoan craftsmen appear to have worked in Egypt. Minoan-style frescoes have been found at sites in the Nile Delta and at Tel el-Daba, a site sometimes associated with the Hyksos period. Minoan influence on Mycenaean culture is enormous and pervasive. The Mycenaeans borrowed heavily from Minoan religion, art, and administrative practice when they took control of the Aegean world in the late 2nd millennium BCE. The Minoan civilization peaked around 1700 to 1500 BCE and then underwent a series of catastrophic disruptions of its own. The first major disruption was the volcanic eruption of Thera, the island now called Santorini, which was one of the largest volcanic events in the past 10,000 years. The Theran eruption, dated by various methods to somewhere between 1650 and 1500 BCE, the dating remains controversial, buried the Minoan town of Akrotiri on Thera under meters of volcanic ash, preserving it in extraordinary detail, a Bronze Age Pompeii of the Aegean. The eruption almost certainly caused tsunamis that damaged Minoan coastal settlements across northern Crete, and the ash fallout may have disrupted agriculture for years afterward. The Minoan civilization survived this catastrophe, but it never fully recovered its earlier power, and by around 1450 BCE, the Mycenaean Greeks had taken control of Crete itself. Linear B tablets appear at Knossos, suggesting Mycenaean administration. The palace at Knossos continued in use under apparent Mycenaean control until its final destruction around 1375 BCE, after which the Minoan palace system effectively ended on Crete, though Minoan cultural traditions continued in various forms for centuries. What does all this have to do with the Sea Peoples? The connection is indirect but important. The Minoan seafaring traditions, the networks of maritime trade and communication that the Minoans had built across the Mediterranean, were inherited by the Mycenaeans who expanded and built upon them. When the Mycenaean system itself collapsed around 1200 BCE, those maritime networks did not simply evaporate. The ships and the sailors and the knowledge of the sea remained. What changed was the political and economic system that had organised maritime activity. In the absence of palace control, maritime activity became more freelance, more opportunistic, and in some cases more piratical. This is one of the threads that connects the late Bronze Age world to the Sea Peoples phenomenon, the transformation of organised Bronze Age maritime trade into something more chaotic, more mobile and more dangerous. The same knowledge of the sea, the same ships, the same routes, but now used by people who no longer had a palace to answer to. Crete itself, after the Bronze Age collapse, underwent the same kind of dramatic cultural simplification as mainland Greece. But Crete has a particular characteristic that preserved some elements of Minoan and Mycenaean culture through the Dark Ages, its mountain refuges. The high mountain valleys of interior Crete, difficult of access and easy to defend, were places where communities could survive even as the coastal centres collapsed, and recent archaeological work in these highland refuges has revealed continuous occupation through the collapse period and beyond. This is where some of the distinctive features of what would become archaic Greek culture may have been preserved through the darkness of the post-collapse centuries. But the most significant thing Crete contributed to the story of the Sea Peoples may be through a different route entirely, through the people we call the Luwians. Anatolia, the vast peninsula that forms the bulk of modern Turkey, was, in the Bronze Age, one of the most linguistically and culturally diverse regions in the world. It was home to the Hittites, of course, but also to a dozen other peoples speaking different languages, following different traditions, and maintaining complex relationships of political subordination, alliance, and occasional rebellion with the Hittite Empire at their centre. Among the most important of these peoples were the Luwians, a group who spoke an Indo-European language closely related to Hittite but distinct from it, and who inhabited a broad arc of territory running from western Anatolia through southern Anatolia, the region the ancients called Lucca, or later Lycia and Cilicia, and into northern Syria. The Luwians are one of the most underappreciated peoples in Bronze Age history, partly because Hittite texts tend to describe them from the perspective of a dominant power looking at its subjects and tributaries, and partly because Luwian texts in the Luwian hieroglyphic script were only deciphered relatively recently. The Swiss scholar Emmanuel Laroche made major advances in deciphering Luwian hieroglyphics in the mid-20th century, and subsequent scholarship has added enormously to our understanding of this script and the language it encoded. What the Luwian inscriptions reveal is a people of considerable sophistication, maintaining their own traditions of monumental inscription, their own religious practices, their own historical self-consciousness, even while living within or on the margins of the Hittite political world. The Luwians are relevant to the Sea People's story for several reasons. First, Western Anatolia, the region of Arzawa, which the Medinet Habu inscription specifically identifies as one of the areas destroyed by the Sea Peoples, was predominantly Luwian-speaking in the Late Bronze Age. If the Sea Peoples did move through or originate from Western Anatolia, they would have encountered and possibly incorporated Luwian populations. Second, the Luca, one of the groups mentioned in Egyptian accounts as associated with or related to the Sea Peoples, inhabited exactly the region of southwestern Anatolia that was Luwian in culture and language. Third, after the Bronze Age collapse, the regions of southern Anatolia that had been Luwian-speaking continued to be inhabited, and Neo-Hittite or Syro-Hittite states emerged in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia in the early 1st millennium BCE, carrying on modified forms of Luwian culture and hieroglyphic script. This continuity is interesting because it suggests that the Luwians, unlike the Mycenaeans or the Hittites proper, were not entirely obliterated by the Bronze Age collapse. Their culture was disrupted and transformed, but strands of it survived. And some scholars have argued that the Luwians were themselves significant participants in the events of the collapse, not simply as victims of the Sea Peoples, but as active agents, some of whom joined the westward flowing tide of migration and raiding that the Egyptians recorded. A particularly intriguing hypothesis, associated with the classic scholar Eberhard Zanger, proposes that a significant portion of the Sea Peoples may have been Luwians from Western Anatolia, displaced by the collapse of the Hittite Empire and seeking new land to settle. Zanger has even provocatively suggested that the legendary city of Troy, Homer's Ilium, may be connected to the Luwians, that the Trojan War tradition preserves a memory of conflicts along the Luwian-Mycenaean interface, possibly connected to the broader crisis of the Late Bronze Age. This is speculative, and Zanger's work has been controversial among specialists, but the broader point that Western Anatolia, Luwian-speaking and distinctively positioned between the Mycenaean world and the Hittite heartland, was a major source of population displacement in the crisis period, has considerable support. The Hittite Empire itself, meanwhile, was collapsing from within even before the external blows fell. The last decades of the Hittite kingdom are obscure, but what evidence we have suggests a state under severe stress. The grain crisis we mentioned earlier, the desperate letters asking for food shipments to Hattusa, speaks to an agricultural system in crisis. Internal conflicts, including a disputed royal succession in the generation before the final collapse, had weakened the central authority, and the empire's frontier regions, exactly the Luwian areas of the west and south, were increasingly restive. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was burned and abandoned around 1180 BCE, but interestingly, it was not destroyed in the way the Levantine cities were. It shows no signs of a massacre, no skeletons left unburied, no treasures abandoned in burning rooms. The evidence suggests that the city was deliberately abandoned and burned by its own population, a managed withdrawal rather than a military defeat. Hittite populations moved south and southeast, into the regions of Anatolia and Syria, where Luwian culture was strong, and it was there that the Neo-Hittite successor states eventually emerged. Where some of them went, however, where some portion of the people who had inhabited the great Hittite cities and the Luwian towns of western Anatolia ended up, may well be among the groups the Egyptians were fighting at the mouths of the Nile. No single place in the Bronze Age collapse story is more central, more fascinating, or more archaeologically rich than Cyprus. This island, sitting in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, within sight on clear days of the Anatolian coast to the north and the Syrian coast to the east, was the pivot around which so much of the Bronze Age trading world turned. Its copper mines produced the metal that gave the Bronze Age its name. Its harbours welcomed ships from Egypt, the Levant, the Aegean, and Anatolia. Its culture was a unique blend of all these influences, so mixed and layered that distinguishing what is Cypriot indigenous from what is Aegean-derived or Levantine-influenced requires very careful archaeological analysis. The The Bronze Age city of Enkomi, on the eastern coast of Cyprus, is one of the key sites for understanding the transition period. Enkomi was a wealthy, cosmopolitan city in the 13th century BCE, a city of copper, smelting and long-distance trade, with a population that appears to have included both indigenous Etio-Cypriot speakers and Cypro-Minoan scribes, and possibly Aegean-born merchants and craftsmen. Its harbour was among the busiest in the eastern Mediterranean, and its copper ingots fed the foundries of the known world. Around 1200 BCE, Enkomi shows a distinct archaeological horizon, a destruction layer, followed by reconstruction with new architectural features and a noticeably different material culture. The new culture shows strong Aegean connections, a style of pottery, a style of architecture, even a type of ritual installation that points strongly to an Aegean homeland for at least some of the new inhabitants. Cyprus, in other words, shows exactly the kind of cultural transformation that the Philistine cities of Canaan show, but slightly earlier, suggesting that Cyprus was a way station in the migration of Aegean populations eastward. This has led many scholars to propose what might be called the Cyprus as staging ground theory, the idea that populations displaced from the Mycenaean world, from mainland Greece, from the Aegean islands, possibly from Crete, first moved to Cyprus, where they mingled with existing populations, and then, in subsequent waves, moved further east and south into the Levant and toward Egypt. Cyprus, on this reading, was not just a victim of the Bronze Age collapse, but also an active participant in the subsequent redistribution of people and culture across the eastern Mediterranean. The Alasea letters, the correspondence found at Ugarit between King Amurapi and the King of Cyprus, suggest that Cyprus was under attack from the Sea Peoples, but they also hint at something more complex, that Cyprus may have been both attacked by and a source of the mobile maritime population that was causing so much disruption. People could be simultaneously refugees and raiders depending on circumstances, and the line between settlement and invasion was not always clear. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for the complexity of this transition comes from the Cypriot site of Mar Paleocastro on the western coast of the island. This is a site that was specifically built as a new fortified settlement around 1200 BCE, not rebuilt on an existing city, but newly founded on a defensible promontory overlooking the sea. The pottery and material culture of Mar Paleocastro is strongly Aegean in character, suggesting a colony of Aegean settlers, but the settlement is also heavily fortified, with walls and towers of a style that suggests the settlers expected attack. This is the footprint of a group of people who arrived by sea, chose a defensible position, built walls, and established themselves. The kind of behaviour that from the outside might look like invasion, but from the inside looks like settlement and survival. After the Bronze Age collapse, Cyprus became one of the more remarkable laboratories for understanding cultural transformation. The Mycenaean Greek language, preserved in the Linear B script before the collapse, survived on Cyprus in a modified form, written in the Cypriot syllabic script, derived from Cypro-Minoan, until relatively late in antiquity. Cyprus is the place where you can trace the most direct cultural thread from the Bronze Age Mycenaean world into the historical Greek world of the first millennium BCE, a thread that runs through the crisis and emergence on the other side, changed but unbroken. And Cyprus, crucially, was the place where the copper that had fed the entire Bronze Age system was mined. The disruption of Cypriot copper production, and there is clear evidence of disruption, with many of the great smelting sites abandoned or reduced in the 12th century BCE, contributed directly to the material collapse of Bronze Age civilization, which depended on bronze and thus on copper and tin for its weapons, its tools, its infrastructure. When Cyprus was disrupted, the ripple effects were felt across the entire Mediterranean. If you want to understand what the Bronze Age collapse actually felt like on the ground, in the cities, in the streets, in the houses of ordinary people, you need to look not at inscriptions and diplomatic letters, but at what archaeologists have found in the earth. And what they have found in city after city along the Levantine coast and across Anatolia and into the Aegean is fire. Fire and its aftermath. The collapsed and burned timbers of roofs, the shattered and fused remains of storage jars, the skeletons, sometimes in unusual positions, sometimes with weapons nearby, of people who did not make it out. The abandoned treasures, hordes of bronze tools and weapons buried beneath floors, presumably hidden by owners who expected to retrieve them and never returned. The sudden absence of the small, persistent marks of daily life, the pottery and the loom weights and the spindle whorls and the foodstuffs that characterize a living city, replaced by the silence of a destruction horizon, and then nothing for centuries. Let us visit these cities one by one, as archaeologists have done, and read their endings. Ugarit, the great merchant city of the Syrian coast, was destroyed around 1185 BCE. Excavations conducted by French teams at Ras Shamra since the 1920s have revealed a destruction horizon of extraordinary completeness. The palace was burned, the temples were destroyed, the great houses of the merchant quarter, wealthy, multi-roomed, architecturally sophisticated, were burned and collapsed. The pottery kilns still contain tablets being fired, as we have already noted. There was evidence of looting before the destruction, but the main event was fire, the kind of conflagration that happens when an entire city burns simultaneously, generating enough heat to melt bronze and fire clay tablets without intending to. After the destruction of Ugarit, the city was never rebuilt. It was not simply conquered and absorbed by a new power, it was erased, and the site remained unoccupied for centuries. Further south along the coast, at sites like Tel Sukas, Sianu and Katna, the same pattern, destruction by fire around the same period, followed by abandonment or severe reduction. The rich, cosmopolitan, trade-dependent cities of the northern Levantine coast essentially ceased to exist. Moving inland to Anatolia, the pattern continues. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was burned and abandoned. But as noted earlier, the nature of the destruction here is different. The systematic nature of the burning, the absence of massacre evidence, the apparent prior removal of movable wealth, all suggest a deliberate abandonment by the city's own population rather than a foreign attack. Someone burned Hattusa, but it may have been the Hittites themselves as they evacuated south. The smaller Hittite and Luwian cities of western and southern Anatolia tell a more complicated story. Some were burned and abandoned, others show population continuity, sometimes with cultural changes that suggest new inhabitants. The coastal cities of Lycia and Pamphylia, exactly the region that would later be associated with the Lucca, show in some cases remarkable continuity, while in others there are destruction horizons followed by simpler, different settlements. Moving to mainland Greece, the Mycenaean palaces tell a consistent story of destruction, though with variations. Pylos, as we have discussed, burned completely around 1180 BCE and was never rebuilt. The Palace of Mycenae itself shows destruction and burning in the same period, though the citadel continued to be occupied at a much reduced level. Tiryns, the great fortress palace on the Argolic plain, shows a similar pattern, destruction followed by reduced occupation. The great palace of Thebes in Boeotia was destroyed around 1225 BCE, a generation before the main collapse wave, suggesting that the process was already underway. In the Aegean islands, the picture is equally dramatic. Rhodes, Kos, and other southeastern Aegean islands show disruption and change in this period, sometimes followed by cultural continuity at a different level. The island of Crete, as already discussed, shows differentiated responses, coastal centres declining, highland refuges persisting. What is striking about all of this destruction is its near simultaneity across a vast geographical area. These cities are separated by hundreds of miles of sea and land, yet their destruction horizons cluster within a few decades on either side of 1200 BCE. Whatever was happening, it was operating across the entire eastern Mediterranean system in a compressed time frame. Archaeologists have found that some sites, particularly smaller, inland sites or sites in naturally defensible positions, survived the collapse relatively intact. This is important. The collapse was not a uniform blanket of destruction. It hit the large coastal trade-dependent centres hardest, while smaller, more self-sufficient communities sometimes persisted. This pattern makes sense if the primary driver of collapse was the disruption of the trade and exchange networks that the great centres depended on. Take away the international trade and the palace economies that needed it, for tin, for copper, for grain, for luxury goods, could not sustain themselves. The physical evidence of destruction, abandonment, and cultural transformation in dozens of sites across the eastern Mediterranean gives us a map of the collapse that is more detailed than any written source, and that map suggests not a single military campaign, not a single enemy, not a single cause, but a cascading, interconnected failure of a system that had become, over centuries of increasing complexity and interdependence, dangerously fragile. The Bronze Age collapse was not simply destruction, though it was certainly that. In its wake, the world reorganized itself, and the reorganization, though it took centuries and was accompanied by enormous suffering, eventually produced a new kind of civilization that was, in certain respects, more resilient and more broadly distributed than what had come before. Let us think about what was lost and what eventually emerged. What was lost was enormous. The palace economies of Mycenaean Greece, with their complex redistributive systems and their ability to organize large-scale production and trade, gone. The Hittite Empire, with its sophisticated legal system, its multilingual diplomacy, its remarkable achievement of governing a vast and diverse territory, gone. The great merchant cities of the Levantine coast, Ugarit and its sister cities, gone. The Bronze Age international trading system, with its movement of copper and tin and grain and luxury goods across the entire Mediterranean, severely disrupted, reduced, transformed almost beyond recognition. Gone too was literacy in significant regions. Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek writing system, disappeared completely with the palaces it had served. The administrative need for writing vanished when the palaces vanished, and the scribal schools that had preserved the knowledge of writing could not survive without the palace system's patronage. Greek would not be written again in the new alphabetic form until around 800 BCE, a gap of 400 years in which the extraordinary achievements of Bronze Age Greece were preserved only in oral tradition, transmitted by bards and storytellers from generation to generation, until Homer and his contemporaries eventually wrote them down. This is what makes Homer so precious and so historically interesting. His poems are not history, but they are the sediment of history, the deposit left by centuries of oral transmission of genuine memories of the Bronze Age world. When Homer describes the wealth of the palaces, the bronze armour of the heroes, the ships with 50 oars, the international cast of heroes from across the Greek world, he is drawing on a cultural memory that, however distorted by centuries of storytelling, has roots in a real Bronze Age world. The catalogue of ships in the second book of the Iliad, which lists the contingents of the Greek army by their home regions with obsessive geographical detail, may preserve genuine Bronze Age geographical knowledge about the distribution of Mycenaean power. But alongside the losses, there were survivors, adaptations, and eventual innovations that transformed the world. Egypt survived, as we have noted, weakened, contracted, no longer the imperial power it had been under Thutmose III or Rameses II, but continuous. The New Kingdom continued through the successors of Rameses III, increasingly dependent on Libyan and other foreign mercenaries in its army, including, perhaps, settled descendants of the very sea peoples they had fought. Eventually the New Kingdom gave way to the Third Intermediate Period, an era of fragmentation and reduced power. But Egypt never experienced the total collapse that overtook the Hittites and the Mycenaeans. The Nile kept flowing, the priests and the monuments and the art and the writing endured. In the Levant, the disruption of the old Canaanite city-state system created a vacuum that was filled by new players. The Philistines, settled in their 5 cities on the southern coast, became one of the important polities of the Iron Age Levant, and their descendants eventually merged into the broader population of the region, leaving their name on a geography that endures to this day. The city of Tyre on the Lebanese coast survived the collapse and emerged in the Iron Age as the greatest maritime trading city of the ancient world, the capital of the Phoenician network that would spread Semitic culture and the alphabet across the entire Mediterranean. The Aramaeans, a Semitic-speaking people who had been relatively marginal in the Bronze Age, emerged in the post-collapse period as a major force in Syria and Mesopotamia, and Aramaic would eventually become the most widely spoken language in the Near East. In Anatolia, the collapse of the Hittite Empire was followed by the emergence of the Neo-Hittite, or Syro-Hittite states, small but culturally sophisticated kingdoms in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria that carried forward elements of Luwian culture, Luwian hieroglyphic script, and Hittite religious traditions. These states, though small, were significant enough to require major campaigns by the Assyrian Empire in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE before they were finally absorbed. In the Aegean, the slow recovery from the Dark Ages eventually produced classical Greek civilization, one of the most consequential cultural achievements in human history. The city-state system that emerged from the post-collapse reorganization of Greek society was fundamentally different from the palace economies of the Bronze Age. More distributed, more competitive, more politically diverse, more capable of innovation precisely because it was not locked into the rigid redistributive hierarchies of the palace system. Whether classical Greek democracy, philosophy, science, and art could have emerged from a world in which the Mycenaean palace system had never collapsed is an interesting counterfactual. But it is at least plausible that the collapse, for all its destruction, cleared space for something new. This is the deep pattern of the Bronze Age collapse. Out of extraordinary destruction came, eventually, the world that produced the Hebrew Bible, the Phoenician alphabet, classical Greek civilization, and the foundations of Iron Age culture across the Mediterranean and Near East. The connections are indirect and complicated, but they are real. The Bronze Age collapse reshuffled the deck, and when the cards were dealt again, the distribution was very different from what had come before. One of the most tangible markers of the transition from the Bronze Age to what follows it is simply metal. The Bronze Age was bronze. What came after was iron. And the story of this transition, why it happened, how it happened, and what it meant, is intimately connected with the collapse. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and both metals are required to make it. Copper was relatively widely distributed, with major sources in Cyprus, Sinai, and various parts of Anatolia. But tin was extraordinarily rare in the Mediterranean and Near East, and it had to be transported enormous distances from sources in Afghanistan, Central Asia, and possibly Britain and Brittany in far northwestern Europe. This meant that bronze production depended inescapably on long-distance trade. A palace that could not maintain its trade connections could not get tin, could not make bronze, could not equip its army or its craftsmen with the metal tools and weapons they needed. This dependency was one of the structural weaknesses of Bronze Age civilization, and the disruption of trade routes during the collapse contributed directly to bronze shortages. The archaeological evidence from late Bronze Age sites shows a dramatic reduction in bronze artifacts in the final decades before collapse. Metals were being hoarded, collected, melted down, reused. The Pylos tablets, as we noted, record the collection of bronze from sanctuaries. This is the behaviour of a society running out of a critical resource. Iron, by contrast, was everywhere. Almost every kind of rock contained some iron, and iron ore was widely available across the Mediterranean, Anatolia, and the Levant. The problem with iron was not availability, but technology. Smelting iron required much higher temperatures than smelting copper or bronze, and the techniques for working iron into useful shapes, forging, quenching, carburizing to produce steel, were considerably more complex than bronze casting. In the Bronze Age, iron was a rare and precious metal, used for small prestige objects and gifts between kings, but not as a practical everyday material. The transition to ironworking as a mass technology appears to have occurred precisely in the period of the collapse and its aftermath, in exactly the regions that were most disrupted. Cyprus, where bronze technology had been so sophisticated, shows early evidence of iron production in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. The Levantine coast, disrupted, trade routes broken, bronze scarce, shows widespread adoption of iron tools and weapons beginning in this period. And in Anatolia, exactly the region that the post-collapse chaos would have disrupted most completely, iron technology seems to have developed further and faster than elsewhere. This is significant. The disruption of the Bronze Age trading system which cut off the tin supplies necessary for bronze may have been one of the key drivers of the transition to iron technology. Necessity, in other words, being the mother of invention, or at least the mother of adoption. Iron had always been technically possible. It became economically necessary when the trade networks that supplied tin collapsed. The political implications of this technological shift were enormous. Bronze production required access to long-distance trade networks, which in turn required the organisational capacity of palace economies. Iron production required only local resources and the technical knowledge of individual smiths. This meant that ironworking could be done almost anywhere, by communities of any size, without dependence on any kind of centralised authority or trading network. Iron was the democratizing metal, and in that democratization lay the seeds of a very different kind of world. Iron weapons were eventually superior to bronze weapons, harder, sharper, more capable of holding an edge. Iron tools were transformative for agriculture, allowing the cultivation of heavier soils that had been difficult to work with bronze or stone implements. The widespread adoption of iron in the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse was one of the factors that eventually allowed denser and more widespread human settlement across Europe and the Near East, contributing to the population growth that underpinned the Iron Age civilizations of the first millennium BCE. The Sea Peoples, interestingly, have sometimes been associated with the spread of iron-working technology. The Philistines in particular, who appear to have maintained a near monopoly on ironworking in the Levant for a period after their settlement. The biblical account in 1 Samuel famously notes that the Philistines would not allow the Israelites to have blacksmiths, lest they make swords, may have been among the early carriers of iron technology from the Aegean world into the Levant. Whether this is accurate is debated, but the connection between the Sea Peoples' migrations and the spread of iron technology is one of the more provocative threads in the collapse story. Of all the groups associated with the Sea Peoples, the Philistines have had the most interesting and most unfair historiographical fate. They have given a word to almost every European language, Philistine, meaning a person who is hostile to art and culture, indifferent to refinement and learning. This is, from a historical standpoint, a near total inversion of the truth. The word Philistine as a pejorative entered European usage through this biblical tradition, specifically through the constant conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites, narrated in the books of Judges, Samuel, and other Hebrew Bible texts. In these accounts, the Philistines are the enemies, the people of Goliath and Delilah, the people who capture Samson and blind him and make him grind at the mill, the people who periodically dominate and humiliate Israel. The association of Philistines with brute force, cruelty, and cultural antagonism comes from this tradition, filtered through centuries of theological and literary commentary. But the archaeological Philistines, the actual people who inhabited the cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, were, as the archaeology reveals, something quite different from the biblical caricature. The Philistines were, first of all, cosmopolitan. Their cities were centres of exactly the kind of international trade and cultural mixing that we associate with sophisticated urban civilization. Ashkelon, which has been excavated extensively by the Leon Levy expedition to Ashkelon under the direction of Lawrence Steger and then Daniel Master over several decades, was a thriving maritime city with a wine production industry of remarkable scale. The winery at Ashkelon, dated to the 12th century BCE, included large fermentation vats, stone-lined presses, and storage facilities for amphora, evidence of commercial wine production at a level that speaks to a sophisticated, market-oriented economy. The Philistine pottery, the Philistine Bishrom ware that so clearly marks their archaeological presence, is, from a purely aesthetic standpoint, beautifully made. It represents a tradition of painted decoration that had deep roots in the Aegean world, adapted and elaborated in its new Levantine setting. The birds and geometric patterns painted on these vessels in black and red are the work of skilled craftspeople maintaining and developing an artistic tradition with evident care. Philistine religion, as revealed by temple excavations at sites like Tel Qasil and Ekron, was complex and sophisticated. The great temple at Ekron, excavated by Trude Dothan and others, was dedicated to a goddess who appears in the records as Ptki, possibly to be identified with the Aegean goddess Potnia, the great goddess of Minoan-Mycenaean religion. The temple complex was enormous, covering significant portions of the city, and the inscription found there, the Ekron royal inscription, one of the very few examples of an actual Philistine text, demonstrates literacy and civic pride. It names the kings of Ekron through several generations and dedicates the temple in their honour. The irony of the Philistine as a pejorative, a slur for someone indifferent to art and culture, is that the actual Philistines were, by every archaeological measure, highly cultured people with a rich artistic tradition, sophisticated religion, and literate self-presentation. They were different from the Canaanites among whom they settled, and different from the Israelites with whom they conflicted, but different is not inferior. The biblical accounts of Philistine-Israelite conflict are, moreover, not simple records of oppression. They are complex narratives in which the Philistines often represent legitimate political and military rivals rather than mere monsters. The story of Samson, ostensibly about the Israelite hero who destroys the Philistines, is also, read carefully, a story about cross-cultural attraction and its dangers. Samson marries a Philistine woman, falls in love with Delilah, is betrayed by those he loves, and ends his life in a kind of tragic grandeur in the temple of the Philistine god Dagon. The emotional complexity of the narrative is not what you would expect from a simple anti-Philistine polemic. The Philistines, as a distinct ethnic and cultural group, gradually merged with the surrounding Canaanite and Israelite populations over the centuries following their initial settlement. By the time of the later biblical period, Philistia was culturally Semitic in most respects, though the geographic and political identity of the Philistine cities persisted. The Assyrian records of the 9th and 8th centuries BCE describe the Philistine cities as independent political entities, each with its own king, echoing the five-city structure described in the biblical books, and eventually these cities were incorporated into the Assyrian provincial system, like dozens of other Levantine polities. The genetic evidence from the Ashkelon excavations, which we mentioned earlier, confirms the gradual merging. The founding population shows clear Aegean ancestry, but by the next few generations, the Aegean genetic signal has faded as the settlers intermarried with local populations. By the 10th or 9th century BCE, the people of Ashkelon were genetically indistinguishable from their Canaanite neighbours. The Philistines had arrived as something distinctly foreign, and they had gradually become part of the landscape, absorbed into the Levantine world they had helped to reshape. Any account of the Bronze Age collapse must grapple with the Trojan War, not because it is a historical event that can be definitively verified, but because the tradition of the Trojan War sits precisely at the intersection of the historical crisis of 1200 BCE and the cultural memory that preserved and transformed that crisis into legend over the following centuries. The basic elements of the Trojan War story are well known. A Greek expedition, led by the king of Mycenae, crosses the Aegean to besiege the city of Troy on the northwestern coast of Anatolia, spending 10 years before the city finally falls through the stratagem of the wooden horse. The heroes are Greeks from across the Mycenaean world: Agamemnon from Mycenae, Achilles from Phthia in Thessaly, Odysseus from Ithaca, Nestor from Pylos, Ajax from Salamis, Diomedes from Argos. Their opponents are Trojans under King Priam with allies from across Anatolia and further afield. What is the historical core of this tradition, if any? Heinrich Schliemann's discovery of Troy gave the tradition a physical reality that it had previously lacked in the modern imagination. The city of Hissarlik, as we have noted, preserves 9 layers of occupation, and one of them, Troy 7a, dating to approximately 1180 BCE, shows destruction by fire. This is the layer most often associated with the Trojan War. But the story is more complicated than a simple match between legend and archaeology. The layer below 7a, Troy 6, was actually a larger, grander city, more consistent with the Homeric descriptions of a wealthy, powerful Troy. Troy 6, however, was not destroyed by human agency. It shows evidence of earthquake damage, followed by partial rebuilding into the smaller, less impressive Troy 7a. Some scholars have proposed that both the earthquake destruction of Troy 6 and the subsequent burning of Troy 7a are somehow reflected in the Trojan War tradition, that the story of Troy's fall conflates real events from different episodes. What we can say with some confidence is that the site of Troy, the city of Wilusa as it's called in Hittite text, was real, was significant, and was the subject of at least diplomatic contact between the Hittites and various Aegean powers. Hittite texts mention correspondence with the king of Ahiawa, a name that almost certainly refers to the Achaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks, about disputes concerning Wilusa. A treaty between a Hittite king and the king of Wilusa has been found, suggesting that Troy was, in the Hittite political system, a client state of some importance in northwestern Anatolia. The Trojan War, if it happened, would have occurred at precisely the moment of maximum Bronze Age instability, in the decades just before or during the Great Collapse. Some scholars, most notably Eric Klein in his book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, have suggested that the Trojan War tradition may preserve a memory of exactly this period of Bronze Age instability, of raiding, warfare, and migration along the Anatolian coast, transformed by centuries of oral transmission into the epic form we know from Homer. This interpretation has considerable appeal. It would explain why the Trojan War was remembered so vividly and for so long, not because it was a single dramatic event, but because it crystallized a period of extraordinary upheaval in the cultural memory of the Greek world. The generation that experienced the end of the Bronze Age experienced something so traumatic and so total. The destruction of the palaces, the collapse of the trading world, the loss of literacy, the fragmentation of society, that its memory haunted subsequent generations for centuries, expressed in the epic tradition as a great war across the sea, as heroes and monsters, as gods taking sides in human conflicts. Homer, composing his epics in perhaps the 8th century BCE, was working with oral material that had been transmitted for 4 centuries or more. By his time, the specific details of the Bronze Age world had been largely forgotten or transformed. The palaces had become impossible. Halls of gold, the Linear B scribes had become bards who sang at the feasts of princes. The bronze weapons of the Mycenaeans had become magical artifacts invested with divine favour. But the emotional truth, the sense of a world at war with itself, of great powers in conflict, of heroes defined by their excellence in combat, preserved something genuine about the Bronze Age world that created it. The Iliad is, among other things, a meditation on the costs of Bronze Age warfare and the fragility of Bronze Age civilization. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greek side, is also the most destructive force in the poem. His anger removes him from the fight, causes the deaths of his companions, and ultimately contributes to the doom of both sides. The Trojans are not villains. Hector, their champion, is in many ways the most admirable figure in the poem, a defender of his city and his family, doomed by forces he cannot control. The war ends with the sacking of Troy, but the victors return home to disaster. Agamemnon to be murdered by his wife, Odysseus to wander for 10 years, the Greek world generally to fracture and diminish. The Odyssey, the sequel, is the story of the aftermath, of the long, difficult journey home through a world full of dangers, of the attempt to reconstruct ordinary life after the extraordinary violence of war. Odysseus's 10-year wandering, his encounters with Cyclopes and Sirens and the suitors infesting his palace, can be read as a metaphor for the long, confused, dangerous period of the post-collapse Dark Ages, the difficulty of finding one's way back to civilization after everything has been disrupted. These are interpretations, not historical arguments, but they suggest something important, that the Bronze Age collapse left such deep marks in human memory that it shaped the foundational texts of Western literature, and that in reading Homer, we are reading, however indirectly, about the world whose destruction created the conditions for classical Greek civilization. After all this exploration of the Bronze Age world, its collapse, and the various peoples involved, we can return to the central question with more tools at our disposal. Who were the Sea Peoples, really? The emerging scholarly consensus, to the extent there is a consensus given how fiercely this topic is debated, is that the Sea Peoples were not a single ethnic group with a single origin, but rather a coalition, or perhaps more accurately a wave, of diverse populations set in motion by the same underlying pressures that were destabilizing the entire Bronze Age system. They were, in this reading, both cause and consequence of the collapse, displaced by drought, famine, and political disruption. They moved through the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that accelerated and amplified the very collapse that had set them in motion. Eric Klein's formulation of the collapse as a systems collapse, the failure not of any single element but of the entire interconnected system, is probably the most widely accepted framework in current scholarship. On this reading, there was no single cause, no single enemy, no single drought, no single disruption. Instead, what happened was the simultaneous or near-simultaneous failure of multiple systems, agricultural, commercial, political, demographic, each of which stressed and weakened the others in a cascade of interconnected failures that no single centre could address. The Sea Peoples in this framework are best understood as one of several stressors, a significant one, but not the only one and not necessarily the primary one. They appear at the climax of the collapse, in the Egyptian records of Rameses III, as the visible face of a crisis that had been building for decades. They are, in a sense, the symptom that the patient was examined for, while the underlying diseases, drought, trade disruption, internal social stresses, agricultural failure, were doing the most profound damage. but individual groups within the Sea People Coalition had their own specific origins and their own specific trajectories, and for some of them, the evidence is now quite strong. The Peliset Philistines, as we have discussed, came from the Aegean world, almost certainly from a mixture of populations including mainland Greek, Aegean island and possibly Cretan elements, with Cyprus as a probable way station in their journey east. The genetic and archaeological evidence for this is now substantial. The Shardana may well have connections with Sardinia, though whether they originated there and migrated east, or whether they represent an Aegean or Anatolian group that eventually settled in Sardinia remains debated. The Bronze Age Nuragic culture of Sardinia is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated cultures of the Mediterranean world, and its connections to the broader Bronze Age trading system deserve more attention than they typically receive. The Cheka are among the more obscure groups, but their name may be connected to the ancient name Sakila or Sakala, and they appear to have settled in the area of Dor on the Palestinian coast, a site that has been extensively excavated and shows cultural evidence consistent with an Aegean origin population arriving in the 12th century BCE. The Danaan and Aquesh remain the most debated. If the Aquesh are indeed Achaeans, Mycenaean Greeks, then the Sea People Coalition included at least some elements that had come directly from the Greek mainland or its immediate Aegean sphere, making the collapse even more self-referentially complex. Mycenaean Greeks, displaced by the collapse of their own palace system, joined the coalition of peoples attacking the surviving Bronze Age centres further east. Recent scholarship has added a further dimension to this already complex picture by examining linguistic evidence more carefully. The study of names, personal names, place names, divine names, preserved in the Egyptian texts and in other contemporary sources, has allowed scholars to make more precise suggestions about the linguistic backgrounds of some Sea People groups. Some names associated with the Peliset, for example, appear to be Indo-European in character, consistent with an Aegean or Western Anatolian origin. Some names associated with other groups suggest Semitic connections, raising the possibility that not all Sea Peoples came from the north and west. The most provocative recent contribution to this debate has come from scholars like Israel Finkelstein and Assyriology specialists, who have examined what happened to the Sea Peoples after the initial period of migration and conflict. The Philistines left a clear archaeological and eventually textual trail, but other groups are harder to trace. The Cheka settled at Dor. The Denian may have settled in the area of the tribe of Dan, a connection that biblical scholars have long noted with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Other groups may have returned westward, eventually contributing to the populations of Cyprus, the Aegean islands, and even, as the Shardana hypothesis suggests, Sardinia. This dispersal, both eastward into the Levant and westward to the Western Mediterranean, is one of the most interesting aspects of the Sea People phenomenon, because it connects the Bronze Age collapse to the early history of the entire Mediterranean world. The 12th century BCE, in this reading, was not just a period of destruction, but a period of creative displacement, of populations mixing, moving, and eventually settling in ways that seeded the cultural landscape of the entire Mediterranean in the subsequent Iron Age. One of the peculiar casualties of the Bronze Age collapse was writing itself, or rather, several writing systems that were in use in the Bronze Age world and then either disappeared or were transformed beyond recognition in the centuries of disruption that followed. We have already mentioned Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek script, which vanished completely with the palace system it served. But there are other writing casualties of the Bronze Age collapse that are in some ways even more mysterious. The Cypro-Minoan script, used on Cyprus throughout the Late Bronze Age for administrative and possibly literary purposes, is one of the most intriguing unsolved puzzles in the study of ancient writing. It is clearly related to the Linear A script of Minoan Crete, and it may be partially related to Linear B, though the exact relationships are disputed. Cypro-Minoan tablets have been found in significant numbers at Bronze Age Cypriot sites, particularly Ankomi and Ugarit, but despite considerable scholarly effort over many decades, the script has not been fully deciphered. We know what it looks like, a graceful syllabic system of some 85 or so distinct signs, but we cannot read it. After the Bronze Age collapse, Cypro-Minoan evolved into the Cypriot syllabic script, which was used to write Greek on Cyprus from around the 11th century BCE until the island's full adoption of the alphabet in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. The existence of this script is one of the most remarkable cultural survivals of the collapse period, a writing system derived from Bronze Age Minoan tradition, adapted to write Greek, surviving for nearly 1,000 years on Cyprus while the mainland Greek world had completely forgotten how to write. The Ugaritic alphabet, meanwhile, was one of the most elegant and efficient writing inventions of the Bronze Age. Unlike the complicated cuneiform syllabaries of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphic and hieratic systems of Egypt, each of which required years of training to master, the Ugaritic alphabet had only 30 signs, each representing a consonant. A scribe could learn it in weeks rather than years. It was used to write literary texts of real beauty. The Baal cycle, a major collection of Ugaritic mythological poetry, has been studied extensively by scholars of comparative religion for the light it sheds on Canaanite religion and its relationship to the Hebrew Bible, as well as commercial and administrative documents. When Ugarit burned, the Ugaritic alphabet went with it. It was never adopted more widely, possibly because it was too associated with the specific cultural world of Ugarit, and when that world burned, the alphabet did not outlive it. The cuneiform alphabets of the Levant that survived the collapse, and there were several related systems in use along the Canaanite coast, were not the Ugaritic system, but the linear alphabets that would eventually give rise to Phoenician, and from Phoenician to the entire family of alphabets used today, including our own. The Phoenician alphabet, which emerged in the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, is one of the most consequential technological inventions in human history. Its 22 consonantal signs, simple enough for even untrained people to learn relatively quickly, democratized literacy in a way that the complex syllabaries of the Bronze Age never could. The Phoenician alphabet spread around the Mediterranean through the maritime trading networks that Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon established in the Iron Age, and as it spread it was adapted for different languages, Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and eventually through Greek, Latin and all the European writing systems derived from it. The alphabet you're reading these words in descends in a direct and traceable line from the Phoenician consonantal alphabet that developed in the post-collapse Levant. There is an argument, not widely made but worth, considering that the Bronze Age collapse was actually a precondition for this alphabetic revolution. The complex syllabaries of the Bronze Age served palace economies and were maintained by palace-trained scribes. The disruption of palace economies disrupted the transmission of those complex scripts and created a space for simpler, more accessible writing systems to emerge and spread. The democratizing technology of the alphabet may have required the destruction of the palace-centered Bronze Age scribal system to find its moment. Whether or not that argument is correct, the timing is suggestive. The Phoenician alphabet appears in the inscriptional record in the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, precisely the post-collapse period, and it spread rapidly in exactly the regions most disrupted by the collapse. The blank slate left by the destruction of Bronze Age culture was written over, in the centuries that followed, by a new kind of writing that anyone could learn. One of the deepest questions raised by the Bronze Age collapse and the Sea Peoples phenomenon is the question of identity itself. How do people define who they are? How does group identity form and dissolve? And how do migrating and mixing populations create new identities out of old ones? This question has taken on new dimensions with the development of ancient DNA analysis, which allows archaeologists to study the actual genetic composition of past populations in ways that were unimaginable a generation ago. The results have sometimes confirmed what material culture analysis had suggested, sometimes complicated it, and occasionally overturned it entirely. The Philistine DNA study we discussed earlier is a good example of how ancient genetics can illuminate the questions surrounding the Sea Peoples. The detection of European, specifically Aegean, ancestry in the founding population of Iron Age Ashkelon confirms that real people with real Aegean origins did migrate to the Levant in the Bronze Age collapse period. This is no longer a matter of inference from pottery styles and architectural parallels. There are human bones with genomes that point clearly to a Western origin. But the DNA study also shows something equally important. Within a few generations, the genetic signal of Aegean origin is substantially diluted. The people of Ashkelon in the 10th or 9th century BCE are genetically similar to their Canaanite neighbours. This rapid genetic integration is significant. It tells us that the Philistines did not remain a genetically isolated population, maintaining strict endogamy. They intermarried with local people, they became part of the local population in biological terms, even as they maintained a distinctive cultural and political identity for several more centuries. This pattern found a population with distinct genetic origin, followed by rapid genetic mixing with local populations while cultural identity is maintained, is exactly what you would expect from a population that arrives as conquerors or settlers with significant military or economic power, establishes its own institutions and culture, but gradually integrates into the surrounding population through intermarriage. It is, in fact, a pattern familiar from many historical conquests and migrations throughout the world. What does it mean, then, to be Philistine? In the founding generation, it meant being someone with biological roots in the Aegean world, carrying specific cultural practices, pottery styles, cooking habits, religious traditions, possibly a language, from that world into a new setting. In subsequent generations, it meant being part of a community that maintained those cultural practices, or modified versions of them, as part of a distinct identity, even as the people in the community became genetically substantially local in origin. Identity, in other words, is not simply genetic. It is cultural, institutional, political, and linguistic. The Philistines maintained a distinct identity for centuries after the genetic signal of their Aegean origins had been mostly absorbed into the surrounding population because they maintained cultural practices, political institutions, and social memory that defined them as Philistine rather than Canaanite or Israelite. This insight, that the cultural identity of the Sea Peoples and their descendants was constructed and maintained through practice and institution, rather than simply inherited biologically, is one of the most important contributions that modern archaeological and genetic work has made to our understanding of the Bronze Age collapse. It suggests that the Bronze Age collapse did not simply destroy the cultures it disrupted. It transformed them, mixed them, and from the mixture created new identities that would define the cultural landscape of the Mediterranean for the next millennium. The story of the Bronze Age collapse and the Sea Peoples is not just ancient history. It is, in a number of quite direct ways, a story with implications for how we understand the present. The most obvious implication is the fragility of complex systems. The Bronze Age world was, as we have seen, a deeply interconnected system, not in the modern digital sense, but in the real material sense of mutual dependence for critical resources. Egypt needed Levantine cedar and Syrian grain connections. The Mycenaeans needed Cypriot copper and probably Afghan tin. The Hittites needed grain from the coast when their harvest failed. Everyone needed everyone else, and when the system began to fail, from whatever combination of drought, political instability, and migration it encountered, it failed comprehensively because the interdependencies that had made it work in times of plenty made it catastrophically brittle in times of stress. This is a systems dynamics problem, and it is one that has attracted the attention of complexity scientists as well as historians. The Bronze Age collapse has become something of a paradigm case in the study of complex system failure, studied not just by historians but by ecologists, economists, and engineers interested in the resilience and fragility of interconnected systems. The work of Thomas Homer Dixon on social resilience, and of scholars like Timothy Kohler working on the collapse of other complex societies, draws on the Bronze Age collapse as a key data point. The specific mechanisms of the collapse, the tight coupling between agricultural output, trade, political stability, and military capacity, the way that a shortage in one area, tin, grain, copper, rippled through the entire system, the way that the loss of one major node, Ugarit Hattusa, disrupted the trade routes that multiple other nodes depended on. These are not abstract historical curiosities. They are patterns that recur in the collapse of complex systems, and understanding them in the Bronze Age context illuminates how similar cascades might work today. Climate change, too, is a connection that resonates. The evidence for drought is a significant contributing factor in the Bronze Age collapse. A prolonged period of reduced rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean that stressed the agricultural foundations of Bronze Age civilization is a sobering historical parallel for a world grappling with the agricultural implications of modern climate change. The Bronze Age societies that suffered most from the drought were precisely those that had grown their populations to the edge of what their agricultural systems could support in normal times, leaving no margin for error when conditions deteriorated. The lesson is not comfortable. The question of migration and its political and cultural consequences is another thread that connects the Bronze Age story to contemporary concerns. The Sea Peoples were, at least partly, a refugee crisis. People displaced from their homes by drought, famine, political collapse, and violence, moving through a world that often received them as threats rather than as people in need. The response of the surviving Bronze Age states, Egypt's military response, the diplomatic flurry of the final decades, the attempts to manage and sometimes absorb the migrants, has obvious contemporary resonances, though the specific circumstances are of course very different. And then there is the question of cultural survival and transformation. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Bronze Age collapse is how much culture survived it, transformed but recognizable. The Minoan and Mycenaean traditions flowed into Greek culture, emerging in new forms in the Iron Age. The Phoenician cities maintained and developed the maritime trading tradition of the Bronze Age. The cuneiform tradition of Mesopotamia continued for centuries after the collapse, eventually producing the astonishing intellectual achievements of Neo-Babylonian and Assyrian civilization. The Hebrew tradition that emerged in post-collapse Canaan preserved elements of Bronze Age religious and literary culture in forms that would eventually become the Hebrew Bible, one of the most influential texts in human history. The collapse was catastrophic, but civilization is also remarkably persistent, and the story of the Bronze Age collapse is ultimately a story not just of what was lost, but of what survived, adapted, and eventually flourished in new forms. The people who lived through those terrible decades of burning cities and failed harvests and desperate migrations could not have known that their descendants would build Greek democracy, Phoenician commerce, Israelite monotheism, and the Iron Age cultures that laid the foundations for much of what we call Western civilization. They could only try to survive, to preserve what they could, to adapt to new circumstances. That they did mostly survive, that enough continuity was preserved through the centuries of darkness that the ancient world could eventually reconstitute something like the complex civilization that the collapse had destroyed, is a testament to human resilience that transcends any particular culture or period. Despite a century of intensive archaeological work, despite the development of ever more sophisticated scientific tools for analysing ancient materials, and despite genuinely transformative advances in our understanding of the Bronze Age world and its collapse, much remains unknown. And in some ways, the more we learn, the more we appreciate the genuine depth of what we do not know. We do not know, definitively, where every group of sea peoples came from. The Peliset-Philistine connection to the Aegean world is well supported, but the specific origin, whether from the Greek mainland, the Aegean islands, Crete, or some combination, remains debated. For many of the other groups, even the basic identification is uncertain. We do not know the full extent of the collapse. New sites are discovered and excavated regularly, and each one adds details that sometimes confirm and sometimes complicate the existing picture. The collapse of the Bronze Age world was not uniform. Some areas recovered relatively quickly, others took centuries, and the patchwork of survival and destruction is only beginning to be understood at a regional level. We do not know the relative weight of different causes. Was climate the primary driver, with the sea peoples and other social disruptions as secondary effects? Or was internal social stress, the weight of palace economies on their populations, the increasing difficulty of maintaining the complex redistributive systems of Bronze Age bureaucracy, the primary driver, with climate as a contributor? Different scholars weight these factors differently, and the honest answer is that we cannot yet assign precise causal fractions to the different elements of what appears to have been a multi-causal catastrophe. We cannot read Cypro-Minoan. This is a significant gap because Cyprus was central to the Bronze Age trading world and to the transition period of the collapse, and the Cypro-Minoan texts may contain information about the events of the 12th century BCE that would be invaluable. Several research teams are actively working on decipherment, using computational methods alongside traditional philological analysis, and there is some cautious optimism that progress may be possible in the coming years. But for now, those texts remain silent. We cannot fully reconstruct the political geography of the transition period, the decades between the final collapse of Bronze Age civilization and the emergence of the Iron Age polities that replaced it. Who controlled what territory, how different groups interacted, what negotiations and conflicts occurred in the vacuum left by the disappearance of the great palace systems? These are questions that the archaeological record can only partially answer, and we have only Egypt's perspective on the sea peoples. The Medini Habu inscriptions, for all their detail, are Egyptian royal propaganda. They tell us what an Egyptian scribe writing for an Egyptian pharaoh wanted to record about the wars of Rameses III, what the Sea Peoples themselves thought about what they were doing, why they were moving, what they hoped to find, what they remembered of the places they had left. We do not know, because they left no texts of their own from this period. The Philistines left inscriptions later, but they are sparse and brief. The other groups left nothing, or nothing that survives. This asymmetry of evidence, the fact that our most detailed textual source comes from one side of the conflict, and from a tradition with strong interests in presenting a specific version of events, is one of the most fundamental challenges in Sea People's research. It is similar to the challenge facing historians of many ancient conflicts. We know what the winners wrote, and the winners write from a particular perspective, and the perspective of the people they defeated, displaced, or absorbed is largely invisible. What we can do, and what archaeologists and historians continue to do, is try to read past the Egyptian perspective to the fuller reality behind it. The pottery styles, the DNA, the dietary practices, the architectural forms, the religious artifacts, all of these tell a story that complements and sometimes complicates the written record, and together they are building an increasingly nuanced and complex picture of one of history's most dramatic transitions. The Bronze Age collapse was so total and so transformative that the civilizations that came after it almost entirely lost the historical memory of what had existed before. The Greeks of the classical period had no clear idea that their Bronze Age predecessors had been literate, palace-dwelling, internationally connected people whose material culture was in some ways comparable to their own. They looked at the massive stone walls of Mycenaean Tiryns, still standing, still impressive centuries after the palaces had been abandoned, and assumed that human beings could not have built them, attributing them to the Cyclops, the mythological one-eyed giants. This forgetting is itself historically significant. The Bronze Age collapse was not just a material catastrophe, it was a cultural catastrophe, a catastrophe of memory and knowledge. The complex information systems that had sustained Bronze Age civilization, the scribble schools, the palace archives, the diplomatic correspondence networks, were so completely disrupted that within a generation or two, the knowledge of how to read and write had simply vanished from significant portions of the Mediterranean world. With writing went the ability to maintain and transmit complex administrative, historical and cultural information, and with that went the specific memory of the Bronze Age world. What survived was oral. Tradition, an oral tradition, as any folklorist will tell you, transforms its material as it transmits it. Over the course of 4 or 5 centuries, real Bronze Age kings became mythological heroes. Real Bronze Age cities became legendary kingdoms. Real Bronze Age conflicts became supernatural battles between gods and mortals. The Trojan War, if it happened at all, was remembered not as a Bronze Age palace, war fought over trade routes and political influence, but as a conflict sparked by divine meddling and heroic passion, a story about the nature of fate and glory and the costs of excessive pride. But in the Middle East, the memory of the Bronze Age world survived somewhat differently. The great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylonia maintained their cuneiform scribal traditions through the collapse period, and their records provide a continuous, if geographically limited, thread of written memory from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. The Assyrian annals, which begin to be detailed in the 9th century BCE, frequently reference earlier events and earlier kings, maintaining a historical consciousness that the Greek world had largely lost. And in the Levant, the Hebrew Bible preserves memories of the Bronze Age world in ways that are only now beginning to be fully appreciated. The patriarchal narratives of Genesis, the accounts of the Exodus and the Conquest, the stories of the Judges, all of these are set, in the biblical chronology, in the late Bronze Age period, and while their historical accuracy as specific narratives is deeply debated, they preserve genuine memories of the Bronze Age environment. The political geography of Canaan, the cultural practices of the period, the existence of specific cities that archaeology has confirmed were occupied in exactly the period the texts describe. The encounter between the Israelites and the Philistines, narrated in detail in the books of Samuel, reflects a historical reality confirmed by archaeology, a newly arrived population on the southern Levantine coast, with distinct material culture and significant military capacity, in competition and conflict with the emerging Israelite polity in the Central Highlands. The Philistines of the biblical narrative were real historical actors, and their role in the story of ancient Israel is not simply that of villains, but of complex political rivals whose pressure on the Israelite chiefdoms contributed to the emergence of the Israelite monarchy under Saul and David. The memory of the collapse itself, the sense of a great catastrophe that had fundamentally changed the world, may be embedded in some of the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible. The imagery of destruction, of burning cities, of peoples uprooted and wandering that recurs in the prophetic text draws on a stock of cultural memory about what civilizational collapse looks like that may ultimately reach back to the events of 1200 BCE and their aftermath, transmitted through centuries of oral tradition and editorial reworking. The rediscovery of the Bronze Age world is one of the great intellectual adventures of the modern era, and it is an adventure that is still underway. When Heinrich Schliemann first put his spade into the hill of Hisarlik in 1870, he was working in an intellectual environment that regarded the Bronze Age, insofar as it was thought about at all, as essentially mythological. Within a century, the picture had been transformed beyond recognition. The excavation of the Amarna archive in 1887 gave us the diplomacy of the Bronze Age in real voices. Arthur Evans's excavations at Knossos from 1900 onward revealed the Minoan civilization to a stunned world. The decipherment of Linear B by the British architect Michael Ventris in 1952, one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, gave us direct access to the Mycenaean world in its own words. The excavations at Ugarit from the 1920s onward revealed the literary and commercial life of the Levantine cities. The decipherment of the Hittite language in 1915 by Bedřich Hrozný opened the entire archive of Hittite history and diplomacy, and the work continues. New sites are discovered and excavated. New analytical techniques, ancient DNA, isotope analysis to trace the origins of materials and people, high-resolution geophysical survey, remote sensing from satellite and drone, are being applied to known sites in ways that generate entirely new kinds of evidence. The ancient DNA revolution of the past decade has been particularly transformative for Sea People research. The ability to extract and sequence DNA from Bronze Age and early Iron Age skeletal remains has moved debates about population movement from the realm of inference to the realm of direct measurement. We can now ask not just, did these people come from somewhere else, but how genetically similar are they to populations in specific places, and get answers that, while not always unambiguous, are far more precise than anything material culture analysis could provide. The isotope analysis of strontium, oxygen, and other elements in human teeth and bones has added another dimension. Because the ratio of these isotopes in the body reflects the geology of the food and water consumed in childhood, they can be used to identify individuals who moved to a new place as adults, people who grew up in one geological environment and died in another. This technique has identified migrants in Bronze Age and early Iron Age contexts at multiple sites, confirming that individual movement as well as group migration was a significant feature of the collapse period. At the same time, advances in our understanding of ancient climate have been transformative. The combination of paleobotanical analysis, the study of ancient pollen in lake sediments, speleothem analysis, isotope records from cave stalagmites and stalactites that reflect past precipitation, and dendrochronology, the study of tree ring patterns that reflect past growing conditions, has allowed paleoclimatologists to reconstruct the climate of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean in considerable detail. The picture that emerges, a period of increasing drought and instability beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for a century or more, has fundamentally changed how historians think about the collapse. Remote sensing has transformed our ability to identify and study ancient sites without disturbing them. Satellite imagery, LIDAR, light detection and ranging, which can reveal surface features invisible to ordinary photography, and multispectral analysis have revealed new sites, traced ancient roads and agricultural systems, and mapped the distribution of settlements in ways that allow much more precise reconstruction of Bronze Age landscapes and demography. The territory around known Bronze Age centres has been found to be far more densely settled, and the extent of Bronze Age land modification far greater than was previously understood, and the underwater world is beginning to yield its secrets. The Bronze Age trading ships that crossed the Mediterranean have left traces on the seafloor, and nautical archaeology, the study of ancient shipwrecks, has produced some of the most dramatic evidence of Bronze Age long-distance trade. The Bronze Age wreck at Uluburun, off the southwestern coast of Turkey, was discovered in 1982 by a sponge diver and subsequently excavated by a team led by Kemal Pulak over 11 seasons of diving, recovering one of the most extraordinary cargoes of the ancient world. Tons of copper ingots in the characteristic oxide shape, ingots of tin, ebony logs, Canaanite jewellery, Egyptian scarabs, Mycenaean pottery, Syrian cylinder seals, a gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, a folding wooden diptych, possibly a writing tablet, with hinges of ivory, Baltic amber beads, and a gold and silver sceptre of types, associated with the coastal cities of the Levant. This one ship, sailing sometime in the late 14th century BCE, carried goods from Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, Mycenaean Greece, Anatolia, the Baltic coast of northern Europe, and possibly Mesopotamia. It is the Bronze Age trading system in a single vessel, preserved on the seafloor for 3,000 years. The Uluburun wreck and the smaller Bronze Age wrecks found elsewhere in the Mediterranean give us a visceral sense of the reality of Bronze Age globalization, the actual ships, the actual cargoes, the actual goods in motion across the Mediterranean world. They transform the Bronze Age from an abstraction reconstructed from tablets and palace ruins into something you can almost touch and smell. The cedar of the ship's hull, the resinous smell of the wine amphorae, the metallic tang of the copper ingots stacked in the hold. These are the tools with which we continue to reconstruct the world that the Sea Peoples disrupted, and the world that rose from its ruins. Each generation of scholars adds new evidence, refines old interpretations, and opens new questions. The Bronze Age collapse, 3,000 years after it happened, is still being investigated, still yielding new data, still generating debate. This is, in a way, the measure of its significance, an event so transformative, so consequential, and so mysterious that it continues to demand explanation and rewards continued attention with new revelations. Let us return, at the end, to the beaches and harbours and open sea where the Sea Peoples first appear in history, not as individual characters with names and faces, because the sources do not give us that, but as shapes in the water, sails on the horizon, figures that appear and act and then move on, leaving changed landscapes in their wake. The Medinet Habu temple still stands in Luxor, the relief still fresh enough on the stone to read in detail on a clear morning when the light comes from the right angle. The rows of prisoners, the overturned ships, the text of Ramesses III's proclamation, all of it preserved in the dry Egyptian air for 3,000 years, waiting for the scholars who would eventually understand what they were looking at. The archive for Ugarit is in the Louvre and in the National Museum in Damascus, and in storage facilities and reading rooms around the world. Those small clay tablets with their wedge-shaped marks carrying the last messages of a civilization that burned before it could send them. Some of the tablets are so well preserved that you can see the fingerprints of the scribe who made them. The pottery of the Philistines fills the display cases of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and the Rockefeller Museum and the storage facilities of a dozen excavations, each piece with its characteristic birds and geometric patterns, each piece a fragment of an Aegean cultural tradition transplanted to the Levantine coast and flourishing there in modified form for centuries. The DNA of the ancient Philistines is in databases maintained by universities in Germany and Israel and the United States, sequences of base pairs extracted from 3,000-year-old teeth, recording in the most fundamental biological language the fact of migration, of people crossing the sea and setting down roots in a new land. The walls of Mycenae still rise above the Argive plain, those enormous limestone blocks piled by the Mycenaean architects who built them, as we now know, though the myth of the Cyclops is easier to believe when you stand before them. The Lion Gate stands as it has stood for 3,000 years, the two lionesses flanking the column above the entrance, worn by millennia of wind and rain, but still recognisable, still impressive. And the Nile still floods, or did until the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s finally ended the annual inundation that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 5 millennia. The pharaohs are in their museums, their linen wrappings intact, their faces still bearing the individual features that distinguished one ruler from another, even through death and 3,000 years of preservation. Ramesses III is there, the man who fought the Sea Peoples and won, or won enough, preserving Egypt when everything else was falling. What did the Sea Peoples leave behind? They left the Philistines and their distinctive culture on the southern Levantine coast. absorbed eventually into the populations of ancient Canaan but leaving their name on a geography, Palestine, that endures to this day, derived ultimately from the Egyptian Peliset, the people who came from the sea. They left, in all probability, their descendants among the populations of Cyprus, where Aegean cultural traditions survived the collapse in modified forms. They left, possibly, contributions to the Nuragic culture of Sardinia, whose mysterious towers still stand on the Sardinian highlands as one of the great archaeological enigmas of the Western Mediterranean. They left disruption and destruction, certainly. The burned cities, the abandoned palaces, the broken trade networks. But they also left, in a sense, the conditions for what came next. The clearing of the Bronze Age system, as catastrophic and as costly as it was, made space for the emergence of the Iron Age cultures that would eventually produce the Hebrew Bible, classical Greek philosophy, and democracy, the Phoenician alphabet that underlies every writing system you are likely to be using today, and the Mediterranean commercial culture that forms one of the deep roots of the modern world. History, of course, does not have clean endings or tidy lessons. The people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse, the farmers whose fields dried up, the merchants whose trade routes were cut, the scribes whose archives burned, the refugees crowded onto ships, the soldiers who died on the beaches of the Nile Delta, did not experience it as a prelude to something better. They experienced it as the end of the world they knew. And for many of them, for their children and grandchildren, it was a dark, difficult, fragmented world that lasted for centuries before something like the old complexity returned. But something always survives. Some thread of continuity always passes through the needle's eye of catastrophe, carrying with it the seeds of what comes next. The Bronze Age did not simply disappear into darkness. It became transformed and attenuated, but genuine. The Iron Age, the age of David and Solomon and Homer and the Phoenician traders, the age that built the foundations on which classical civilization would eventually rise. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, wherever they came from, however many different groups and nations and desperate migrations are compressed into that single Egyptian phrase, were part of that transformation. Not the cause of it, not the heroes or villains of it, but participants in one of the great convulsive reorganizations of human civilization, one of those periodic moments when the world that is meets the world that is coming, and neither survives the encounter unchanged. That is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. That is the story of the Sea Peoples, and it is, in ways both obvious and subtle, a story that is still being told. Think, as you close your eyes, of the Eastern Mediterranean on a clear night around 1200 BCE. Think of the stars over the sea, the same stars we have tonight, the same constellations that guided Bronze Age sailors across the darkness. And beneath them, the last lights of the great cities going out one by one, like candles extinguished by a wind you cannot see. Think of the scribes who worked late in the palace at Ugarit, scratching their last tablets by lamplight, not knowing these would be the last words they ever wrote. Think of the sailors on the Sea People ships, watching the fires of a burning city behind them and the dark unknown ahead. Think of the farmers in the dry hills of Anatolia, their wells going lower each year, deciding finally that they have to leave. Think of the Egyptian soldiers on the shore watching the horizon for sails, knowing something was coming, not knowing exactly what or when. The Bronze Age world was not a paradise. It was a world of hierarchy and slavery and constant war, of farmers who worked to feed palaces they had no voice in, governing, of kings who built their monuments on the labour of thousands. But it was also a world of extraordinary human achievement, of art and literature and music and science and philosophy in embryo, of trade networks that connected people across thousands of miles, of diplomatic relationships that sometimes prevented wars and sometimes ended them, of cities where people from a dozen different nations and languages lived and worked together in something like peace. It was a world that created things of beauty, the golden death masks of Mycenae, the frescoes of Akrotiri, the carved ivory cosmetic boxes of Ugarit, the painted pottery of the Philistines, the hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover the walls of Egyptian temples like the text of a vast 3,000-year-old book. It was a world whose people loved their children, feared their gods, and hoped for a good harvest and a fair wind. And it ended, as all worlds end, and something new grew in its place. The ruins of that world are still here, under the soil of Syria and Turkey and Greece and Israel and Egypt and Cyprus. The Bronze Age world waits to be discovered, to be read, to be understood. Every archaeological season brings new finds. Every advance in scientific technique reveals new details. The story of the Bronze Age collapse, and of the sea peoples who participated in it, is not finished. It is a story still being told by the Earth itself, in the language of potsherds and carbon isotopes and ancient DNA, a language that scholars are slowly, painstakingly learning to read. The seas that the sea peoples sailed are still there, still blue and still deep, the same waters that carried the copper ingots of the Uluburun wreck, the same waters that the Philistines crossed on their way to Canaan, the same waters that Odysseus navigated on his long way home. When a wave breaks on a beach in Cyprus or Syria or Turkey or Greece, it breaks on the same sand that Bronze Age feet walked on, the same shore that Bronze Age eyes looked out from toward the open sea. There is something deeply restful in that thought. The ancient world does not disappear. It persists beneath the present, a palimpsest of human experience, layer upon layer going down and down and down. The Bronze Age is there, the sea peoples are there, all those worlds that ended are still present, waiting in the earth and the water, in the ruins and the DNA and the letters carved in stone and clay. Sleep well, knowing that the story is longer than any single life, longer than any single civilization, longer even than the darkness between one world and the next. It continues, it always continues. No account of the Bronze Age collapse would be complete without some attention to the history of how scholars have understood it, because that history is itself a fascinating story of changing assumptions, new discoveries, and evolving methodologies. The term sea peoples itself is a modern scholarly invention. The Egyptians called them by their group names, Peliset, Cheka, Shekelesh, and so on, and sometimes referred to them collectively as peoples of the sea or peoples from the islands, but the consolidated scholarly label sea peoples was standardized in the late 19th century by the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero, who worked extensively with the Medinet Habu texts, and whose synthesis of the Egyptian material laid the foundation for all subsequent scholarship on the topic. For much of the 20th century, the dominant interpretation of the sea peoples and the Bronze Age collapse was what we might call the invasion hypothesis, the idea that a massive migration or invasion of peoples from the north and west crashed into the Bronze Age world and simply destroyed it by force. This interpretation made a kind of intuitive sense given the dramatic scale of the destruction and the clear evidence of movement from west to east in the Egyptian accounts. The sea peoples on this reading were, essentially like the later barbarian invasions that ended the Western Roman Empire, an external force overwhelming a weakened civilization. Robert Drews, in his influential 1993 book The End of the Bronze Age, offered an important modification of this view. Rather than attributing the collapse to a migration per se, Drews argued for a military revolution, a change in combat tactics, specifically the adoption of slashing swords and new infantry fighting methods by the peoples he identified as sea peoples, which rendered the chariot-based armies of the Bronze Age states suddenly obsolete. On this reading, the collapse was driven by a kind of arms race upset. The established military technology of the great empires was suddenly defeated by new tactics, and without their military superiority the empires could not maintain themselves. Drews's thesis attracted significant attention and significant criticism. Critics pointed out that the evidence for a sudden tactical revolution was not as strong as he suggested, and that the collapse was too geographically comprehensive and too total, affecting agricultural systems, writing, trade and administration, as well as military affairs, to be explained by military tactics alone. The pendulum then swung toward what might be called the internal collapse theory, associated with scholars like Mario Liverani, who emphasized the structural weaknesses of Bronze Age palace economies, their exploitative relationship with rural populations, the rigidity of their administrative systems, the way they concentrated resources at the center while leaving peripheral populations exposed, as the primary causes of collapse. On this reading, the sea peoples and other external actors were opportunists exploiting systems that were already failing from within. The climate turn in Bronze Age studies, which gained significant momentum in the 2000s, with the publication of multiple paleoclimatological studies pointing to a late Bronze Age, drought shifted the discussion again. Brandon Drake's 2012 paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science synthesizing paleoclimate data from multiple sources was particularly influential in bringing the climate hypothesis to widespread attention within Bronze Age studies. though some historians argued that the temporal correspondence between drought and collapse was imprecise enough to require caution in inferring causation. The current synthesis, as represented most prominently in Eric Klein's widely read 2014 book 1177 BC, emphasizes the multi-causal nature of the collapse, the idea that no single factor was decisive, but that drought, migration, trade disruption, internal social stress, and possibly seismic activity combined in a perfect storm of system failure. This synthesis is probably the most widely held view among active researchers today, though debates about the relative weight of different factors continue. What is striking about the historiography is how much it has been shaped by the broader intellectual and cultural context in which scholars worked. The 19th century emphasis on invasion and racial migration reflected the historiographical assumptions of that era. The mid-20th century focus on internal social contradictions reflected the influence of social science approaches on history. The current emphasis on systems, complexity, and multicausality reflects the intellectual environment of our own time, with its awareness of interconnected global systems and their potential fragility. This does not mean that any of these interpretations is simply a reflection of its time. Each has engaged seriously with the evidence and made genuine contributions to understanding. But it does mean that the story of the Bronze Age collapse, like all historical stories, is partly a story about the present as well as the past, about what we find important, what questions we ask, and what analytical frameworks we bring to the evidence. The evidence itself is fixed. The tablets are what they are. The destruction horizons are where they are. The DNA is what it is. But the story we tell from that evidence is always evolving, always provisional, always open to revision as new evidence emerges and as new analytical tools allow us to see old evidence in new ways. That is what keeps the Bronze Age collapse alive as a scholarly problem. Not just that it was historically significant, though it was, but that it remains genuinely mysterious in ways that reward continued investigation. And so, the work continues. Excavations proceed at dozens of sites across the eastern Mediterranean. DNA is extracted from ancient bones. Pollen cores are analysed. Satellite images are processed. Tablets are reread with fresh eyes and new linguistic tools. Graduate students write dissertations, present papers at conferences, debate their interpretations with colleagues. The ancient world yields its secrets slowly, reluctantly, incompletely, but it does yield them, and each revelation adds a piece to a picture that is becoming, slowly, more legible. 3,000 years after the Bronze Age collapse, we are still trying to understand it. We are still asking the same fundamental questions that the ancient Egyptians implicitly raised when they recorded the coming of the Sea Peoples on the walls of Medinet Habu. Where did these people come from? What did they want? Why did the world change so completely and so quickly? We do not have final answers. We probably never will. But we have, after a century and a half of scholarship, a much richer and more nuanced understanding of the questions, and that, in history as in life, is often the best we can hope for. The stones remember, the clay remembers, the earth remembers, and we, standing at the far end of the long river of time that began in those Bronze Age courts and harbours and temples, are still learning to read what they remember, still learning to hear the voices of the people who lived and died and built and burned and migrated and survived 3,000 years ago, at the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the next one. The great civilizations of the Bronze Age built monuments intended to last forever, temples and palaces and inscriptions that they believed would carry their names and deeds into eternity. In a sense, they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined, because here we are, 3,000 years later, still reading their letters, still studying their faces in art and in death, still arguing about what happened to them and why. The pharaohs wanted to be remembered, and they are remembered. The merchants of Ugarit recorded their transactions carefully, and their records survive. The Hittite kings sent diplomatic letters in careful Akkadian, and those letters can be read today. But the people they did not write about, the farmers and sailors and migrants, the people who loaded the ships and tended the fields and, eventually, when the world broke down around them, picked up their families and their possessions and walked away toward a horizon that offered only uncertainty. Those people are remembered too in the DNA of their descendants and in the cultural practices that persisted through the darkness and emerged, transformed, on the other side. The Philistine potters who painted birds on their bowls, the Cypriot metalworkers who kept the copper flowing even as the great palace economies that had organised the trade collapsed around them. The Greek bards who remembered the palaces, the heroes, the ships with 50 oars, and kept the memory alive in song through 400 years of darkness until someone finally wrote it down. History is not made only by kings and scribes. It is made by everyone who ever lived and chose and acted, and some of those choices and actions 3,000 years later still matter. The word we use for the people of ancient Canaan, the Philistines, carries, with it, even in its modern pejorative use, a memory of the Bronze Age collapse, of people arriving from the sea, of a world reshuffled by catastrophe. That memory is distorted, and the pejorative is unjust, but the connection is real, a thread stretching from a burning city on the Aegean coast, across the sea to a new settlement in Canaan, through centuries of conflict and cultural mixing, into the Hebrew Bible, and thence into the European tradition, and into the word you may have used thoughtlessly to describe someone with uncultured tastes. The Bronze Age is not over. It is still here, woven into the language we speak and the stories we tell, and the questions we ask about who we are and where we came from. Every time someone picks up a piece of painted pottery from an ancient site, every time a geneticist sequences DNA from a 3,000-year-old tooth, every time a philologist reads a newly discovered clay tablet, they are continuing a conversation with the Bronze Age, asking, it questions, listening for its answers. And on clear nights, when the stars are out over the Mediterranean, the same stars that guided the Bronze Age ships across the same dark water, it is possible to feel, if only briefly and imperfectly, the weight of all those vanished lives, all that lost complexity, all that human effort and hope and ingenuity that built a world and saw it fall, and built it again, differently from the ruins.